And we're back, 2021. Welcome to Abstractable. This is the podcast for the entrepreneurial spirited, the curious, the hungry, and the people who are interested in the future. We distill down the ideas of the world's best thinkers as business, startups, psychology, politics, sports, music, and many other areas. To kick things off for this year, we reflect on 2020 and take a look into the future and what the next decade might hold for us.
Yeah, so we discuss, well, very briefly, we might add, just so you're not too worried, COVID and other important things that happened in 2020, such as, some of these conspiracy theories and the post-truth world we're living in, as well as what it's been like to be at home for most of the year, which is kind of unusual. We also discuss the future and what it might hold in the sphere of energy, automation, and the future of work, because we ran out of time and we're enjoying ourselves so much, is now going to become a two-parter where we continue to talk about the future in the next episode as well. And why? Well, reflecting on the year that's been lets us learn from the past, and looking into the future is not only good fun and almost certainly fraught with incorrect predictions, but it can let us know how to best benefit from what is to come. So don't forget, you can find full video of our episodes on YouTube and check out the show notes and other things at our website, www.abstractable.co. We hope you enjoy this episode.
A proper cup of coffee in a proper cup of coffee pot. Fucking hell. Where did I get that from? Actually, I know where I got that from. The Crown.
Okay. Have you watched it? I hear it's very good.
Yeah. Caught up now. I was a whole 2 seasons behind, but now I've seen it all.
So is it supposed to be like real life? Like, is it sort of semi-biographical, or is it made up?
I think you'd put it in the same ilk as. Okay, maybe not quite the same ilk, but same ilk as the Rolling Thunder Review. So yes, it's totally like fictional, but it's supposed to portray history.
Gotcha.
And supposedly it does a pretty good representation of it all. I do not keep up with my local monarchy knowledge sessions, but apparently it's quite representative of what's been happening.
Is it safe to say that? Are they going to come after you now?
I'm now a bit concerned, given how close I am and given the country I'm currently residing in. That already puts me in a really bad spot.
Well, yeah, Lizzie might come after you over the channel. Yeah, look, folks, we're dealing with a pretty significant lag here. If there's a little bit of a gap between the different the conversation between us, but anyway, that's the internet.
Well, that's clearly a faulty underwater cable or something, not doing its job, connecting us, mate. We need Starlink, something we can get into the episode. So talking about the monarchy, are you for the monarchy? Are you for Republican or for the Republic? Sorry, or are you totally impartial on the whole idea?
I think one of the nice things about living in Australia or a relatively stable country is you don't really have to care. So don't have particularly strong feelings. I feel like the monarchy, it's probably time to let it go, but you'd only do it in a way that meant that it was a really solid setup here. Would have to be really well thought out, I think, rather than just someone who wants to be a president, the first president of Australia or whatever we call it.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Yeah. I agree with what you're saying, mate. Because there's the Governor General at the moment, and the Governor General is the representative of the monarch in Australia, and they're almost like an arbiter. And so there's a fascinating role of having that arbiter sitting, within the the space of your constitution. I don't know how often they've actually used their full rights of their position. Probably only once or twice or something. It hasn't been many times at all. But I think there's something important having that feature there. And I wonder if we had have flipped the whole situation in the States over the last month or few weeks or whatever it's been. I wonder how that, and sorry, referring to the soon to be relinquished of his duties Trump situation. I wonder whether there would have been an opportunity, or whether it would have been a point at which this arbiter would have stepped in and played their role.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess the difference is that, probably the main thing is we see our Prime Minister as almost like a bureaucrat. Whereas if they become a proper head of state, then it becomes a bit more than that. It becomes the religious element's not the right word, but it's sort of it's more of it's a moral thing or something too, or representative. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but I think you probably get my meaning. If you look at someone at a Trump rally, no one's doing that for Scott Morrison.
I wonder if that's a sign of like a cultural thing, just the nature of Australians, or wonder if it's almost like a symptom or a externality of the way in which we are governed. Don't know. And I think what you're getting at, mate, is there's a definite concentration of power that happens when you have got that presidency versus what the situation is in Australia. I think maybe the other thing to consider is you'd probably suggest that the two major parties in Australia are probably a lot more central or a little bit closer to one another than what the two major parties are in the States. Would that be a fair representation?
I think so. Yeah.
So I think that polarization creates in itself a bit of that vigor, a bit of that religious fervor that you see over in the States. It's the natural way with polarization, and we've seen that blow up in many ways across what was 2020.
Yeah, that's it. So this episode is kind of a reflection on 2020, but we're going to spend most of it hopefully talking about the future and a little bit about what we've been up to as well. But don't want to dwell too hard on what everyone's heard about 1,000 times about 2020 and all the obvious things that kind of have filled up the airwaves over the last 12 months. But we will do a tiny bit of that, and then we're going to try and talk about what basically the next 10 years might bring.
It was too big of a impactful and shake up of a year not to give it its due, but we don't need to be having the same conversations that every one of us has been having every single day of last year. So the obvious.
So what time limit are we giving ourselves?
Mate, we're gonna give ourselves 20 minutes on all this stuff, and if we run over, then we're done. We're finished. We're just gonna hang up our boots.
All right. For the people, I'm cutting it down to 15.
We'll hang up our boots. We'll hang up our boots Okay. Well, I was going to say we'll hang up our boots if the internet doesn't do it for us before that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, sounds good. So, what did happen last year? Not
All right.
much.
Bushfires. So let's not drop them off the list. Bushfires for Australians, COVID for the globe, political instability, remote working, and I think a overall change in perspective of the entire world.
Fuck, that's actually a really good point.
Oh, and Trump. Actually, I forgot about Trump. Trump losing the election. Sorry, supposedly losing the election, depending on who you talk to.
You please. We all know that's bullshit, and you're going to get us banned from YouTube if you're not careful. Well,
Twitter and Facebook.
I think mostly it will be remembered for the year that Abstractable was launched. So when
yes,
people
of course.
look back,
The most pivotal part of the year.
So, what's 2 or 3 things from COVID that stuck with you that perhaps aren't talked about as much? Or you can give me one. That really kind of sticks in your mind that you've noticed.
I don't know. Like I think, mate, that COVID has been it's been an inflection point for a lot of things, and I think we do talk about a lot of the bad associated with it, but let's not discount a lot of the good. And also, just before I get into that, I don't want to undermine just how much loss of life there's been, and how many terrible situations, including people that are going to have prolonged issues going into the future. However, I think it's shown a lot of good for taking humanity at a broader level forward. Hopefully, we had ludicrous fast times on vaccine development, which we'll get into just shortly. But it's that has not been seen, particularly on the scale at which vaccines needed to be rolled out. And obviously, looking across the entire year, everyone's thinking, "Where's this vaccine? What's going on with this vaccine?" But it was the first vaccine was developed back in January 2020. It was ready to roll. It just had to go through all the usual process. Right.
That's pretty incredible, isn't it?
It is. And so I think there's that. I think there's hopefully going to be a robusting or countries making themselves further robust. And I think we're going to see a permanent shift in workforce.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think for me, it was sort of how quickly the cultural norm can change. Like living in Victoria, in Australia, 1 week you felt like a weirdo wearing a mask. And then a week later, you felt like a social pariah if you weren't wearing one. So it can really change very quickly what is like normal and acceptable. I don't think I've ever seen that in my life happen so quickly than this year. And that was very, very interesting in terms of the way we behave as groups. And probably just the reflection of how unprepared any government was for anything like this, and how pretty much all of them on some level have failed to really, respond in a way that's saved lives for people. I mean, some countries have, but...
Can you ever do it right, mate? Like, could you ever do it right? Could you ever do it without any loss of life or any hospitalisation or any kind of exposure at all? Is there's a bit of a bend
No.
that needs to happen in the system, don't you think?
I think so, but I think that's a very binary view. No lives lost or all. I think it's sort of a fair. I think just a fair view of everything would just say that no one was ready. Firstly, and then secondly, the actual approaches to minimising the spread of this thing have been very disjointed at best and just all over the place at worst, I reckon. That's just my personal opinion. I'm not saying the people didn't try bloody hard or that there hasn't been success. Like in Australia, we've hardly had any of it. But at the same time, I think if you were to take all the governments in the world who we give the responsibility to look after health and health response, almost in every country, I'm just not sure they were ready or did a particularly great job, and a lot of people died.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree with that, mate. I mean, the ones that have been through it before, particularly, the various Asian countries that have had exposure to a number of these types of pandemics or epidemics in the past, they have had more systems in place to cope and to deal, and we've seen a lot of them kind of rebound back a lot faster than other places. Certainly other places around the world, particularly the Western world, are struggling big time, even now with even struggling to get a vaccine rolled out.
Some of it's got to, and like the ones that look the worst are the people who are actually reporting their cases too. So, there's probably a lot of undiagnosed cases out there, or some governments don't feel like telling us about it. But then again, there is personal responsibility to look after yourself too. But there's only so much you can do if you've got to go out and go to work and make sure you're earning for your family and things like that. So it's very complicated. But it's not totally the government's responsibility to look after us, but at the same time, they do kind of coordinate things. So
mate, COVID was the big ship rolling down the Thames this year. What were all the ripple effects that came off the back of it?
I think it probably supercharged this kind of political instability or factionalism that's sort of developing across the world, and probably supercharged the sort of post-truth life that we live in, or what have you, where you're just not, there's a lot of information out there from different sources, what's actually true and what isn't, what do you choose to believe? I think that probably got amped up this year as well. What do you think?
There's been a lot of conspiracy theories this year. Like, there's always a lot of conspiracy theories, but it feels like that this year's there's been just so many more. Now, this is the other thing is some conspiracy theories are actually true. And so we have a perpetual problem with this is we're now in a place through the likes of social media that anyone with a conspiracy theory can, theoretically get a platform to spread their message. And I think you look at like flat earthers as a classic case in point of that very thing. But there's been some, less easily falsifiable conspiracy theories that have come out of last year. And I think there's a lot more investigation that needs to go into some of these things. We were talking about Trump maybe being out of the election. Now, that's obviously brought up the conspiracy of the entire election's being rigged, which I don't think is is right to say. But you probably can't completely discount that there is a level of election fraud that goes on in all elections, and so it's probably really brought that type of behaviour to light. The same for the origins of COVID, and we've all heard many of those conspiracy theories this year.
Very difficult to know what, it does make you think what is actually true and what isn't. I mean, the Trump style lying feels like that's just more fantasy, That's gone beyond something that you can analyze. It's sort of, he kind of puts his supporters into some sort of like different state of mind where it's like you can believe an alternate reality. Oh, they stole it from us, Yeah, they did, Fuck, if that's true, that's really exciting and interesting. It's us versus the world. It's us saving America. But there's some other, like something maybe like the coronavirus, perhaps the origin of the coronavirus is a little more subtle and I'm trying to think of another example, but that's probably the one that you brought up. Where, how do you can work on the balance of probabilities, but pretty much at some point you're just trusting someone who's told you. You kind of pick who to trust in the end. I'm not going to Wuhan to investigate this. So who do you trust and you just believe what they're going to tell you, right? So
well, this is
we've all got them, and
because
and the just to finish that point, I think that there's a lot more people to choose from now than there used to be. Used to be maybe four or five. Now there's hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, the big thing here is okay. I'll tell you something I actually tried to do last year a little bit more of, and that was to spread my sources of information a little bit wider, like making an intentional effort to actually spread the nose cone a little bit broader so I could take in almost polarizing views and not get sucked into the vortex of, complete partisanship from one side on anything, any particular matter. I found that quite an interesting exercise. And even mates, because of all the other things that have been happening in the world, you may not have heard about like Uganda at the moment, for example, and the Ugandan election. And so, that was another thing I thought was quite interesting is not just following things that are from the typical, Western first world countries that we typically hear from, but trying to spread that out a little bit. And so, like the Ugandan election, Bobby Wine at the moment is or has effectively been elected in, and I believe won enough votes is the way I understand it at this point in time. But because it's a complete dictatorship, I can't recall the name of the dictator that's in power or has been in power forever. But effectively, he's tried to use military force and judicial force to take that away. It's like a more extreme version of what actually happened in the States. It's just that there's far more widespread corruption and less kind of systems in place to deal with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happens. Like, I think I mentioned on another podcast, like Wuhan. I didn't even know that was a place, and it's a huge city. A lot of the world you don't even notice, do you? But maybe
There's too much to take in, mate. There's too much to take in. And I think the crux of it is we've moved from the age of information to the age of misinformation. And well, even in the scientific community, you can bend and sway narratives around any particular scientific study that you want to prove. Because there's a study that proves everything. And so you just build up enough data points of studies that prove the story that you want to prove, and you tell whatever story you want to tell. And this is a huge problem in the academic community. And this is where you start to move into there's ideas around like, I believe it's like entropy based academia, where it doesn't just talk about like, the classic correlation that you look for in a scientific study, but it talks about the impact that those two variables have on one another, and the kind of the strong coupling that those two variables have with one another, as a way to tell a more full story in this thing. And rather than just pulling out correlation for the sake of correlation. And it sounds like there's a bit of a movement in the scientific community to try and push academia in that direction, to create a little bit more falsifiability and a little bit more critical kind of analysis.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Sounds positive. So probably the last thing about 2020, you could talk about it for hours, was just, I guess a lot of us spent a lot of time in our homes.
And with our families, potentially.
Yeah. Back in the day where most people were farmers, that probably happened a lot. But since then, since the major industrial revolution, maybe this year's the most time that people have spent at home in many decades.
How have you found it, mate? What have you thought about spending so much time at home?
Well, I actually quite enjoyed it to a point, If you didn't think too much about what you were missing out on or what life used to be like, it was quite pleasant. I felt less stressed, I reckon. And it allowed me to do more sort of deep work, but it was quite hard to do anything where you needed to coordinate your life. You used to go to the shops to look at something or something like that, but you couldn't do that anymore. So it's a slower, simpler life, I think. It was quite nice, so I'd like to try and introduce more of that into my life going forward. However, as soon as I was able to, I made sure I was out of the house most of the time again. So what does that say? Obviously.
So it says you've been missing the outside, mate.
Yeah.
You're soaking up that Aussie vitamin D in the sun.
That's it. Yeah, it's been nice to get out and about, I'll tell you what. But I guess the other thing, you can adapt pretty quickly when you need to, and innovation, fear is a great driver of innovation. I think that's the other thing I've learnt this year. So,
tell us more.
Well, I guess your vaccine point is pretty valid. It's like, or on a smaller scale, everyone pretty quickly learned how to have a video meeting, or to set up a home workstation and work remotely or work from the cloud. The uptake in those technologies was absolutely huge. Whole giant organizations restructured, including governments, to work from home. And, government employees got laptops. So, all these things just happened in a flick of a switch when it sort of had to happen. And so change and innovation, if there's a stressor applied and people really feel that impetus, can overcome the barriers of, I've done things like, at home, set up all this stuff and done Teams meetings and things that I'd really never done before. And I think I'm fairly technologically able. Us recording this podcast like this via the internet, something I had no idea of. So
Yeah. Well, mate, it was like, well, war is like the ultimate stick in the motivational sense of the carrot and the stick, but like COVID was a pretty big stick again, and it seems that when society has these big sticks to deal with, it's very able to kind of coordinate action and kind of file into line and get things done. And it's almost like there was a gain in focus and a gain in clarity. And I've been actually reading a book on, I'm still reading it at the moment, is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. We'll do an episode on that. And it really emphasizes how most businesses, most organizations, most even government at a governmental level are too diffuse in their focus. And as a result, you're just doing a below par, truly subpar job of all the things that you set out to do, rather than doing just a few things really well, or really setting out a synergistic course of action that you're trying to go on. And so it's almost like, that big stick of COVID has come in and forced a clearer line to the vision that every organization needed to get to.
interesting. So tell me about the future.
What's coming?
Yeah.
Well, let's start with energy, mate.
So would Nassim be just hating us right now? Or are we making predictions here?
Well, because
Is this what the game we're getting into? Or are we? It's more stargazing. What might happen, right?
well,
this is
I
this is
wouldn't
our
even
time
go that far,
capsule.
mate. Like we're not even stargazing. We're talking about things that are at the moment, and I think we might do a couple of glances up at the stars throughout. So he may not completely, backhand us, and he might accept this as being okay.
Yeah, okay. So basically this is what might happen given the technology that's developing at the moment over the next 10 years. It'd be fun to listen to this in 10 years' time and see what other things occurred.
Well, mate, this is our little letter that we put in the drawer and don't open until 2030.
Yeah, a letter in a bottle. I mean, energy's the big. That is, I reckon, it's got to be the decade where we either sort out climate change or we're doomed to suffer its consequences.
Yeah. What do you follow the energy scene much, mate?
I read a book on it by Ross Garneau about the Australian energy sector. And that was pretty good. It interests me, but I don't have a deep knowledge of it. But an article you sent me that we both read and found quite interesting, kind of talked about it a bit more by Ellie Duorado, who's kind of like a economist futurist. Talked a bit about it, and so I've got a bit of a knowledge, but I'm no expert.
So the this is undoubtedly going to be the decade that we see fossil fuels, be properly phased out. I think this must be the decade that we're at that.
Well, I think the last few years has really shown, with electric cars and, you see a lot of more solar and wind farms and a bit more battery technology, that it really is now here. The the issue is going to be, well, I think, and a real driver is that and this was in that book, that effectively the price of solar and wind has dropped a lot quicker than anyone predicted. And so it is competitive, and coal is now not the cheapest fuel. Lignite maybe in Victoria is still very cheap, but it's sort of at that tipping point now where other forms of energy generation are actually cheaper, and that's when you start to see quick change, I think, is once people are motivated by the economics of it, particularly big businesses. It should change quickly. And then
mate,
also
the market gets motivated, everyone else does.
Yeah. And I guess you've got a lot of other challenges with regulation, vested interests. I think also the public is kind of on board now. The vast majority of the public really wants to do something green, but needs it to be easy and make some financial sense. And we're getting to that tipping point, I reckon.
We are. I
think
it's already at that point.
I don't know,
the
though,
challenge. Sorry, you go.
One of the things I don't know was that the internet. One of the things I don't know is whether that holds true in like some of the real big developing nations. So,
well, this is the thing. Is this? Correct me if I'm wrong here, mate, but I believe the studies on the economic viability of where energy's at the moment is that if you were to build a new from scratch equivalent situation between, say, coal-fired power, a coal-fired powered plant versus a solar farm or a wind farm or something, that per kilowatt it would cost you a lot more, or cost you more going down the coal path, is the way I understand it. And so
I believe that to be true also.
Yeah, and so the challenge that you have in Australia at the moment is, but as you say, it is surely tipping further and further, is that we have so much outlaid in that space. And so there's all this pre-existing investment that's creating these huge shackles, not to mention the associated exports and stuff that we've had. But funnily enough, given all the excitement of last year, in particular China, a lot of that export has slowed down a bit.
There appears to be also a huge opportunity to generate renewable energy in Australia for very, very cheap dollars and use that on very energy intensive industries such as like smelting aluminium and things like that, and bring that back to Australia and actually use the natural resources we have of the sun and that to really make us competitive in making things again. That was super interesting. But I guess the intermittent issue, and it's really a lot of this decade from the start of it, after year one, I guess, has already happened, is going to have a lot to do with batteries.
I see, mates, the batteries is tied into this. As we're talking about this now, I see this decade as being the decade of decentralisation. We're going to see a huge uptake in blockchain. So not just Bitcoin, and we're actually going to start seeing some valuable products being developed. We're going to see some of the internet moving more and more towards blockchain, and real life value coming from them, rather than this kind of tokeny stuff that we're really dealing with at the moment. We're also seeing the same thing happening in the energy sphere. And so something to bear in mind is the coal plants and oil is very centralized. It's very controlled around a resource sitting in one particular location, controlled by one particular company. Whereas when we're talking solar, we've got farmers in Australia who are now transferring their land from being, grazing land and putting solar farms on it. And, they're paying those things off in just a few years, nothing at all. And then they've got this solar farm sitting there generating electricity, generating them consistent income. And that's incredible. And we're seeing the same thing happen with microgrids and batteries and wind and everything else that's associated with it. Everyone's going to be able to put solar, on top of their houses, or we might get to the point that they don't even need to do that. There might be more community solar panels somewhere, or there might be one particular person who's generating so much fucking electricity that within the microgrid of your community, you're able to sustain yourselves with all the electricity that you need. And so this is huge. And so you can see that there's big incentives for certain companies to try and slow this down as much as possible.
Yeah, but even the companies that own coal-fired power stations and stuff like that huge companies have made commitments to get out of that game. Now they're like AGL and Engie and guys like that. Now they are companies that have kind of sold that as, hey, we're going green, but there's a financial reason. They spend more time than anyone studying these markets, and they know what the future is. So to me, that's a big, sort of, divining rod or whatever, a bit of a clear indicator of where stuff's going. I love that idea of that it's the decade of decentralisation that you brought up, because it makes a huge amount of sense. And sharing the energy across the grid from generating it in a lot of different locations is pretty awesome, really. One of the big centralised, probably still centralised generation sort of ideas is still nuclear, and even fusion potentially into the future. But nuclear fission is
talk to me about nuclear,
something. Mate. Well, I guess, after I think most of us have watched that Bill Gates documentary where he's looked into, I suppose, these new types of nuclear power plants. And there seem to be people that are inventing stuff that's on a smaller scale. And most of the old nuclear technology, most of the plants that exist are built off very old sort of designs and technologies. But there's so much regulation around the space that it actually is pretty difficult to get a new project up and running and actually get it on the ground. And the public just doesn't have the appetite for it, despite it being quite a clean way to generate
Australia
electricity.
Do you think Australia will ever have a nuclear power plant, Lockie?
Not a big one. So I think nuclear is pretty much dead as an idea, unless they can get it really, really small. And so people may have
interesting take.
People may have tiny nuclear power plants on there to power certain things. That may be an idea. You might have one for a neighborhood or something, or even smaller. You might have one power a mine or something. I don't know. That's just my take, with no evidence. It's just my gut feel of the public sentiment.
I encountered a few interesting people and articles the other day because there's kind of been a resurfacing of nuclear, and it almost seems to coincide with obviously the Gates doco as well. But obviously fusion. Fusion is the it's the prize. It's the prize that awaits, and it's the prize that we potentially need to get to in order to particularly from like a space travel perspective, etc. But also, arguably, if you're going that far into fusion, which, mind you, is in all from what I've read, is not going to be something that happens this decade. We're still a long way away from fusion, and so the next gen fission reactors that are getting spoken about also aren't here yet. In a way that is able to be built on a commercial scale, or whatever you call commercial in the space of nuclear. Industrial scale is probably the word. And so, as far as what I've read about it is, fission is dead in the water compared to renewables. But there's obviously this big gap in between that you kind of need to continue doing the R&D around it all so that you can maybe eventually get to this fusion. And so it's quite an interesting place. But from what it sounds like, Australia certainly won't ever have nuclear. Nuclear is being pushed by certain companies and certain people to try and keep the mission going, but as far as the economics and the economics of it all stand up, it just doesn't look like a feasible option.
Fusion seems to me like something that might be more useful fusion would be awesome, but it seems to me to have more of like a space application. On this kind of idea of decentralization of energy generation and things like that, I actually think that it's probably the decade of a few other things that probably happen is like more stuff's getting automated, whether it's through robotics or computer machine learning or whatever. But energy generation, say, getting cheaper and more decentralized in a place like Australia. I think the combination of those things might mean that we actually bring a lot of manufacturing back to Australia, and that we start building stuff in the country again by the end of the decade. But that the connectivity of the internet and other things will probably have an effect on white collar work, what sort of blue collar work went through when everything got offshored. So low hanging sort of white collar work may end up getting either offshored or automated and disrupted in a much more meaningful way than just or Detroit getting decimated because everything got moved offshore in America for actually making cars. Some of that sort of stuff might actually come back to developed nations.
That's that's a really fascinating take, mate. It's like you're seeing
that'll be interesting.
Well, I first of all agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like white collar workers are going to take a huge hit this decade with automation, with artificial intelligence. And it's fascinating what you talk about, the kind of the blue collar, the harder industries having a resurgence. And there's a definite possibility of that, right? And I don't think it will be like it used to be, though. I think the way it will make a resurgence is if there is a lot more automation through the entire process and there's people controlling huge portions of the supply or the manufacturing chain themselves, as opposed to looking at one particular section or something, or one particular part. but that seems feasible. The challenge is building the infrastructure that doesn't exist here. Like very little infrastructure, particularly when you compare it to the likes of China or Taiwan or the other big manufacturing industries.
It might just end up being cheaper to 3D print it here than sending the plans offshore and then shipping it all back, So we'll see.
I like that a lot, mate. And this raises another point is I think with the huge shift we're going to see in white collar work is the rise of the gig economy again. The gig economy is another form of decentralisation that's going to happen, where people are potentially less bound to big corporates and more of on a contractual nature dealing with work that they want to deal with. But I'm also you're also looking at like some of the big tech companies and even some of the not tech but just the startup-y vibe companies getting around, and some of them have quite family sort cultures. So I think people will seek that out as well, and I think that will increase. So I think like the social cohesion and the family orientated businesses, even for big businesses, might take an increase there because I think people are less accepting of ludicrous positions, working exorbitant hours with no work-life balance. I don't think those days are numbered, but I think that them being totally ubiquitous across corporates is, I think that's going to take a shift.
Well, you're right. I mean, the other social institutions that perhaps used to plug the gap of, I'm getting fucked over at work, working in this factory, but at least I get to go to church on Sunday or be with my family or have these other local community sort of stuff. None of that really exists. Most people don't know their neighbours, let alone have that strong community, particularly people who live in cities, which is the vast majority of the populations. So, work needs to fill more of those gaps, particularly with the amount of time we spend there. But the exploitation of white collar workers is something that's, we were reading an article about last night. I forwarded you. It is a big thing now. And it probably has some parallels to what the blue collar work went through and still goes through. But certainly those that unionised kind of fixed a lot of that in Australia, but there's still heaps of it that goes on and a lot of exploitation. I'm not suggesting that, but nonetheless, it's not like early days in the Industrial Revolution, is it? But then you've got these people working for big accountancies working 14, 12-hour days, 6-7 days a week.
Yeah, working for the man, as we would say.
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. The future of work is something I'm really interested in. But I tend to think that you're pretty spot on about the increase of the gig economy. What might go with that, though, as well, is that may have a little bit of a negative thing, is that if you can buy from the best, can't remember where we read this. This was definitely in a book. But if you can buy a design from the greatest graphic designer or the top 10 in the world through the internet, well, it's going to be really hard for me to compete with the best engineer in the world because I'm far from that. So, you get globalized, you might get forced out and it might become a winner takes all style game that is pretty hard to compete in for your average person.
This is spot on, mate. And then this brings us to the classic UBI argument, where universal basic income. I don't think we're going to see it this decade, but I think in the following decade we're going to start seeing real implementation of that.
Can you explain what that means? I don't actually understand what that is.
So effectively, mate, universal basic income is that everyone gets a guaranteed amount of income to live, and so effectively you don't have to work at all to not just get by, but to live at a basic level. And the reason that this gets increasingly spoken about is because of the obvious rise in a lot of this automation, a lot of this probably not artificial intelligence, more like general artificial intelligence, which is still quite a long way away, but maybe getting quite a bit closer by the end of this decade. And it'll be an overhaul. It'll completely change the way in which we do things. However, what kind of jumps out at me, mate, is coupling all this stuff with the likes of space and the likes of space travel, which we haven't gotten onto yet. It's I see that there's going to be lots of opportunities continue to open up, and it's almost like once humanity gets off Earth, which is starting to look like more and more of a realistic thing. It was almost farcical a few years ago, even 5 years ago, I think. But some of the stuff that we've seen this year is just gobsmacking. And if everything keeps continuing the way it is in all of these various industries, then we're going to see this. We're going to move to a space going race.
Well, maybe what we do is, we're at an hour now. So I reckon this has got another episode in it. So I think the teaser for the next episode is we're going to talk about space, health, and getting around. So vehicles and transportation. And I reckon maybe we just cap this episode off with a little bit.
And I will say, mate, every single one of those topics is decentralisation is a core theme again. Now, just looking over them all. So I think there's a nice theme that we've picked up here.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you about hydrothermal energy before we close the energy loop. So this is something you sent me something about that I had not even ever thought of as a possibility, but I think it's quite clever. And I've actually never heard it talked about anywhere else but in what you sent me. So what's the idea with that?
I love the old handball. I think I've probably got just as much idea as you, because I think I'd probably read one other article about geothermal previously, but it sounds like it's an increasingly vibrant space. It's almost like the ugly child that just doesn't get spoken about. And so basically what's happening is, as far as what I know, is our capability in drilling is getting a lot better. And because this is a major part of this geo stuff, and our mechanisms for harnessing this energy that comes as a result of these geothermal, there's particular locations I believe that you have to do this in, particularly where like the crust is quite thin. But there's effectively this big glowing mass of molten iron sitting not too far below our feet comparatively to the size of the Earth, and it's an untapped, almost infinite source of energy for us in some regards. And so there's a lot of opportunity here to literally tap into that. But yeah, it doesn't get a lot of airtime compared to all the other big players.
Yeah, and what interested me is I associate geothermal with somewhere like Iceland, where you know the conditions are that it's a very volcanic area, and a lot of the heat is close to the surface. But it seems like with gas and fracking and those kind of things coming to an end, or becoming less and less viable, that a lot of people who used to do oil drilling and things like that are turning their eyes to this sort of idea of geothermal everywhere, not just in these places where it's really easy. And so they could be drilling a whole heap of holes and only need a much smaller temperature differential to generate electricity or power from sort of the difference in temperature in the earth and the depth that they're able to drill. Never heard that before. If that happens, that'd be pretty cool, and also quite out of left field. So watch out for that one.
I think so, and it sounds like quite promising from what I've read so far. But it's just a quiet little thing sitting in the background.
Yeah, energy is the cornerstone to all else, though, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right there, mate. Well, we've constructed society to be totally reliant on energy now. Like if energy production stops, today, not only are we not going to be able to turn the lights on and get to travel and everything else, like all of our information is gone effectively. Like everything's on the cloud, everything's gone. We are totally coupled with energy. There's no doubt about it.
Fascinating.
So, mate, because we are splitting this into two, we do need to have a ending quote still, I think, for both parts, as is good fashion. So we are talking about the future, so no better way to round the episode off. We got one from Albert Einstein.
Ooh.
And we were talking about a few negative things at the start of the episode, and for a man that was living around, I guess around World War II time, so it was probably quite front of mind. But he's got a great little quote, which ties into your favourite energy source, nuclear, Lockie. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Fantastic.
That's great, mate. That's a good start to the 2021 and the first episode of the year. And thanks everyone for listening to the show.
Thank you. Bye.